Hello, everyone. Um, this chapter of the book, namely Social Structure of Turkey, Volume 1, provides you a historical presentation concerning the gender and women in Turkey. It mainly deals with social position of women in Turkey in a historical context and also critically provide you some information concerning women's movement in Turkey. Briefly saying, this chapter first of all discuss on women's status and movements in the Ottoman Empire as well as in the Republican era. Following this, the chapter talks about the influence of industrializations and urbanizing on gender relations, particularly between 1950s and 1980s. Then the chapter focuses on the social position of women and the main achievements of the women's movements during 1980s and 1990s. And lastly, the chapter aims to inform you about certain concepts like gender mainstreaming, gender sensitivity, and gender equality. Let's start with the first aim of the book, which is about women's status and movements in the last period of the Ottoman Empire and in the beginning of the Republican era. Looking at the women's social positions in the Ottoman Empire, the first thing that we can notice is women held a social status unequal to men. In the Ottoman Empire, women's lives were mostly placed in a private sphere, and they were mostly prevented from appearing in the public sphere. Obviously, some limited progress emerged in the status of women due to the modernizations and reform movements in the last period of the Ottoman Empire. However, women continued to suffer from secondary and subordinate social status in the Ottoman society. Contemporary feminist researchers revealed that a woman literature and the women's movement that bring women's demands in the agenda emerged in the last period of the Ottoman Empire. We can see that in the last period of the Ottoman Empire, women started to take part in public sphere increasingly and working life too. Radical changes that regulate the status of women according to the legal principles have been achieved in the Republican era of Turkey. As a result of the reforms in the Republican period, women had quite equal rights with men in many areas such as education, clothing, marriage and divorcing, as well as parental rights, inheritance, voting, and being elected, and so forth. It's usually said that all of these rights and achievements wouldn't have been gained if they were not state policies in the Republican era. However, some studies after the 1980s revealed that women's struggle to gain these rights also played an important role. The pioneers of the women's studies in Turkey also argue that while the legal changes that were provided from the state from top to bottom entitled women with fundamental human rights, the male-dominated social structure didn't change in the Republican era. Looking at the influence of industrialization and urbanization on gender relations, we can say that 1950s opened up a new period in Turkey. It has also opened a new era in terms of women's social position. This period is characterized with the transition from a single-party politics to a multi-party politics. It is also known as a period of implementations of statist liberal policies. In addition, rapid industrialization and urbanization that led to a considerable amount of migration within the country resulted in the emergence of new dynamics that seriously affected the social status of women in the social structure of Turkey. From this period onwards, with the development and growth in the educational system, industrial production and service sector, women have had the opportunity to participate in education and working life relatively more than the previous period previous to the 1950s. Thus, there was an increase in the involvement of women in the economic activities and public services in this period. Various studies demonstrate that women's ongoing roles within the patriarchal family and the structural characteristic of urban economic life were the main reasons for the limited presence of women in paid jobs. After a long period of silence between 1950s and 1980s, the women's movement went into a search for an identity with the political movements of this period. The feminist movement, initiated by well-educated professionals in the urban area, influenced by the second wave feminism, which questioned gender relationship not only in the public sphere but also in the private sphere too. This triggered the feminist movement, and along with the rise of this feminist movement, the gender question began to occupy an important place on the social agenda during 1980s. As the women's problems began to be discussed in all areas of the society, the women's movement became increasingly legitimate in the public opinion. As a result, throughout the 1980s, a number of actions were taken and a series of activities were organized to increase the public awareness of gender equality and discrimination. Social position of women in terms of participation in public institution in 1980s and looking at the main achievements of women movements after the 1990s. We can say that there were some instances of relative increase in women's involvement in certain sectors. However, those figures in labor statistics indicating the involvement of women in working life continue to be low. In fact, women were involved in economic activities for far lower than men. The ratio of women labor was quite low in the organized formal industry and service sector, but it was very high in the non-organized informal sector. Within the female labor force, unpaid female labor in agricultural sector was quite high during 1980s. The schooling rate of young girls in this period was also lower than that of boys. However, we should also emphasize that a considerable improvement has been achieved compared to the previous period, previous to the 1980s. On the other hand, girls' participation in primary, secondary, and higher education was far from being equals to those of boys. But it demonstrated a significant increase from the early Republican period to the 1980s. Thanks to the institutionalization and new legislations, as well as the collaboration between public and women organizations, some developments were achieved in the era of 1990s in gender equality. An important development of this period was that we call gender mainstreaming strategy, that we are going to also discuss later on in this video. But briefly saying, gender mainstreaming strategy has become an issue in the agenda of the government and civil society today. In the beginning of the 21st century, women's organizations succeeded in keeping gender problems in the agenda with their influential activities. As a result, fundamental changes were made in the articles of family law, and women also participated in working life and political life more than the previous period during the beginning of the 21st century. But they were still less involved than men in various areas. Looking at the certain concepts which are quite important in terms of discussing women and gender relationship in sociological theories, we can see three important concepts which are gender mainstreaming, gender sensitivity, and gender equality. Those concepts can be considered as some of the basic concepts of the sociological discussions on gender questions, and your book provides quite illuminating explanations concerning these concepts. First of all, gender mainstreaming and gender sensitivity are basically policies. In their simplest form, they can be considered as aims, objectives to promote equal access to public resources by men and women in the society. Mainstreaming a gender perspective is the process of assessing the implications of any planned action. These actions can be legislations, policies, or any form of program in all areas and at all levels of social and economic life. It's a strategy for making women's concerns and experiencing a dimension of discussion while designing and implementations of policies in political sphere, economic sphere, or our social sphere. The purpose behind this is that both women and men should benefit equally from the fruits of the policies. Gender budgeting is a gender-based assessment of budgets. It advocates the idea that incorporating a gender perspective at all levels of budgetary process with the purpose of promoting gender equality. This chapter of the book Social Structure of Turkey, Volume 1, primarily aims to inform readers concerning to gender and related issues in historical context in Turkey. It firstly provides information concerning to the women's social status in Ottoman Empire's last period and the Republican era, initial period of the modern Turkey. And secondly, it also focuses on the influences of industrializations and urbanization on gender relations, particularly between 1950s and 1980s. Then the chapter turns its attention to discuss social position of women in terms of participating in public institutions and achievements of women movements during 1980s and 1990s. Lastly, this chapter also aims to inform you about certain concepts which are the basic concepts of discussion concerning to gender equality. These concepts are gender mainstreaming, gender sensitivity, and gender equality. Thank you to join me today.